Maybe Invar will start now that it's 3 o'clock.
Okay,
Others can join.
Okay.
Yeah, so thank you, everyone. I just want to say thank you for joining us, and I want to welcome Stephen Laurie, Chairman of the World Board of Trustees, to say a few words and to open this Zoom. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks, Invar. I'm guessing everybody's on mute, other than those that are going to speak. I also like to say that there is translation on the Zoom in both Portuguese and Spanish. I think you know how to do that on your Zooms, and it's really a pleasure to get everybody together. We haven't been together as a senior leadership group of Karen Hayesod for some time, but we are in a particularly difficult moment. And we felt it. I know it was also short notice, but the best things happen in short notice, and we felt it was really important to get together now. It's 10 p.m. In Sydney right now, and listening to the beginning of the call, I think we're well represented from all our regions around the world: Australia and Canada, Europe, South America, Latin America, parts of Asia, and I'm not sure South Africa. I may have missed something, but we hope so. And it's really a pleasure to have everybody here. Edna is going to take over in a couple of minutes. I'm really just here to welcome you all. Edna, our CEO and Director General, and Mazel Tov to you, Edna, for the bar mitzvah of your youngest son. Nice to do that in front of everybody. I'd also like to mention Sam Grunberg, our world chairman. Sam did make it on the call. I think he's in his car or some place. He's on reserve duty at the moment. I think most, if not all of you, know that Sam is a casualty officer, and sadly he's had way too much to do since October the 7th. But we pray you actually are out of a job, Sam, and you have a very boring couple of weeks of Milawim ahead of you. I see you are in uniform. I'm not sure if the Wi-Fi is so good at the army base, but no doubt you'll chime in whenever you feel appropriate to. I would also like to welcome Haviv, Rettig, and Jonathan Conricus. I think I haven't met you, Jonathan, but Haviv I've met many times. There would be rarely a week or a few days that go by, Haviv, where I don't hear you in your commentary somewhere on various podcasts that are very important and frequent these days. But it's really good to see you speaking to the Karen Hayesod world. We appreciate you spoke to the Karen Hayesod ILR a few months ago, and it's always I always come away much richer in knowledge from listening to you. So I'm very much looking forward to you speaking to the Karen Hayesod leadership, and Jonathan, also to you. And I know that first I think Haviv will say a few words, and then Jonathan, and then there'll be a dialogue between you, and then we'll make sure we have time for questions, which either I guess Inbar or Edna may manage. This is a very important time. I mean, it's amazing to think we're 303 days since October the 7th, and we still very sadly have 115 hostages that are not home, and of course we have 143,000 evacuees still not at home. 76,000 of those, I'm told, in the north, and 67,000 in the south. And this is just unbelievable to think that today we are still having to be in this position, and clearly as we speak today to each other, we're at a very important moment in where the war will go, and the issues clearly with Iran, and on many fronts we're at the cusp of possibly a regional war on many fronts. And I'm no expert here, but obviously we're all students of this very carefully on a daily basis. There would not be a day that goes by where none of us wake up in the morning and the first thing we do is look at the news, and the last thing we do at night is look at the news. And in the day, we're interrupted all day. What's going on today in Israel? But I would also say the same thing in the diaspora. Anti-Semitism is shocking. We're all in all of our various countries, communities where we operate, where we live, where we socialize, where we have our lives. We are all experiencing a time like we've never experienced before. There's a well-known case just in Australia in the last week, where a Jew wearing a kippah was not served in a major store in Melbourne, in a suburb of Melbourne, and it's clearly these are small issues, but they're little cracks, and these little cracks need to be filled so they don't become big cracks. And these are just small experiences, but I think from a safety and security perspective, all of our communities around the world are on tenterhooks at the moment and very high alert, and not just in Israel. So I think we're all well aware of what I'm speaking about. As we sit here today, I've actually been to Israel 6 times, since October the 7th. And clearly we're all very well aware of how difficult and tough it still is today. Economically, it's incredibly difficult. Obviously, with so many people dislodged from their homes and their businesses and their families, at war, and soldiers. Capital injections into Israel are very weak compared to what they were beforehand. Socially, the fabric of society in many communities has been ripped apart. Obviously, the recent announcement of the in the north, and particularly with the school year, this will be the 2nd year in a row. And I think if you take that into account and add it to what happened with COVID just a few years ago, you probably have 3 or 4 years of severely disrupted education for so many young people in Israel. And I'm sure the effects of that really won't be understood for a long period of time. Politically, the situation is very divided, and also we clearly have an election in the US, which is impacting many decisions and motivations from the US government right now, which I'm sure we all have a very strong view about. And militarily, we're all well aware of the situation we're in today and where it's possibly heading. So I will actually pause there, because I really want to allow time for everybody, for the more educated and informed speakers. I'm sure you're all here to listen to them. But before I do hand over, I do want to remind us of how powerful the network of the Jewish diaspora is. And as you all know, I'm very, very proud of all of us. I'm very proud of how we have all reacted in the Keren Hayesod family, the Keren Hayesod world, to the events since October the 7th. We have raised in the order of $148 million since October the 7th. 125 million of that has actually been received, not just pledged, but been received in Israel. And the vast majority of that has already been dispersed. But of course, there are many issues that we need to attend to at the moment. But because of the war, the rebuilding of the South has clearly been delayed, and we're obviously well aware of getting our people back home to the North as well. I will pause there, but I do want to thank us for the work that we've done, but remind us of the work that will be coming, because the coming years ahead will be very difficult. And whilst we pray for peace and stability as soon as possible, and victory, no doubt, we also will be well aware of the role that the diaspora will be needed to play in the rebuilding of the country going forward. Thank you, everybody. It's a privilege to have everybody on the call tonight. And Edna, I'll now ask you to take over. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. It's very important for us. We know it's a short notice, but it's important to do this briefing. Actually, today, as Stephen mentioned, 303 days since October the 7th, and today morning we had a terror attack here in Israel. 2 people were killed and 2 others severely injured. Today, we're also marking the birthday, 5 years old, of Ariel Bibas, one of the kids of the Bibas family who's hostage in Gaza, and we're praying for his return. Since October the 7th, Keren HaYesod has jumped into action immediately, and thanks to you, our donors, together we've supported mostly the victims of terror. Stephen mentioned the numbers before. About 40% of what we've already dispersed went to the Jewish Agency, our major partner, and most of it went to the Victims of Terror Fund, which distributed funds for over 8,572 households, beneficiaries. At the beginning of the war, the estimation was that we're going to have about 8,500 beneficiaries to the fund, and we've already exceeded this number. If God forbid we're going to have a regional war coming, the numbers are going to be totally different, and we'll have to be ready for that. In addition to that, Keren HaYesod also supported 15 regional councils, municipalities, and towns in the north and in the south. We've already also supported hospitals in the north and in the south. And we've also helped businesses, small businesses, by giving them emergency grants and supported different populations such as New Olim and elderly people and youth at risk and more. Right now, as we've mentioned in our previous conversations, we're focusing on rehabilitation of communities, mostly right now in the south, because the situation there is much clearer than in the north. And Keren HaYesod adopted 10 different communities in the south, in the Western Negev, in addition to 3 additional communities that were adopted separately via Canada and Keren HaYesod's campaign, and we're focusing on their needs. We're doing that also through the Campers Together program. 2 weeks ago, I came back from France, where I went to visit 2 different camps where kids from the Western Negev went to be together with kids from the French community and the Belgian community. And it was amazing. It filled my heart to see them. They were having a break from what they're going through. They met new friends. They've learned to know the strength of the Jewish community around the world, and it gave them a lot of resilience and power to go back to their houses once the camp is over. We're also focusing right now in the safety of the communities. As Stephen mentioned before, the current situation of the community is unstable. So we're working with the Jewish Agency for the security fund for the communities around the world, but also for the security of the communities here in Israel, as we're focusing on shelters and helping our population, the Jewish Agency project in the south and in the north. We've gathered this important briefing today because it seems like we're facing a potential regional war in the upcoming days or hours. Ever since last week, we keep getting notices that it's coming. You should be ready. On Thursday, as Stephen mentioned before, we had the bar mitzvah of my son, and during the bar mitzvah, somebody said, you have to be home by 5 because the attack is going to start by 5. We have all kinds of rumor, and everybody's preparing themselves to the worst. So earlier today, the senior professional team here in Israel, we've gathered to discuss the situation, what might happen, and scenarios that we might need to face. We have to be ready that we're going to have disconnection here in Israel, and we won't be able to communicate via cellular, or we're not going to have the internet. We're not going to have electricity at all. So we wanted to create ways of communication between ourselves and between the campaigns. We wanted to make sure that we have all the materials to be sent to the campaigns in advance. And we're focusing on additional campaign, immediate campaign, if God forbids we're going to have a regional war. So this Zoom today is to help us to have a better understanding and a broader understanding of the situation here in Israel that we're facing. And we want to hear from professionals about the worlds of security and media, and the political arena of your thoughts, Haviv and Jonathan, about the future. I'll be very happy to learn more. So I'm happy to introduce our two speakers. The first is Lieutenant Colonel Conricus. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correct. Jonathan is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and the owner of Conricus Communication. He recently retired from the IDF and after serving as a combat commander in Lebanon and in the northern Negev for 24 years. He's a military diplomat, a foreign relations expert, and an international spokesperson. Haviv Rettig is a veteran Israeli journalist who serves as a senior analyst for the Times of Israel. He's covered Israel politics, foreign policy, education system, and relationship with the diaspora since 2005. He has reported from over 20 countries. He served as Director of Communications for the Jewish Agency for Israel, our partner, and taught at the prestige pre-military academies. So I'm happy to introduce Haviv. Haviv will be our first speaker. Then afterwards, Jonathan will speak, and then we're going to have a dialogue between the two of them. Haviv, thank you.
Thank you so much, Edna. Thank you, Stephen. Jonathan, it's the second time on your opening act in the last few months. Although last time you were on Zoom you were still in uniform, so I don't know if you knew that I was in the room after you or just before you. Thank you very much for being here, everybody. This is a crowd that knows a great deal of what's going on. And as Stephen and Edna told us in great detail, you're involved in solutions. And so I'm not going to waste your time with sort of an overview of Israeli society, where it's at. There's some concern over the Israeli government. I don't know if you've heard, but we're going to dive right in to questions that, frankly, I'm just going to completely selfishly use this opportunity to set the table for Jonathan to lay out for us some of the serious strategic dilemmas that Israel faces at this moment. And doing that, we're going to maybe give a sense of how likely war is, how bad that war could be, what the good case, the best case scenario is, what the worst case scenario is, whether Israeli society is ready for that kind of a war. Hezbollah in the north. Oh, I was just told to set my speaking language. Okay. I hope the translation is working. I'm going to speak a little bit slower to make it easier for the translator. Hezbollah in the north has presented Israel with, in one sense, an extraordinary challenge and a really profound dilemma. And in another sense, is struggling against its own success. And I'm going to try and make that argument in 8 minutes and then turn the microphone over to Jonathan. Hezbollah has been telling us for 10 months, but explicitly for roughly 2 months. Back in June, Nasrallah gave a speech in which he did something really unexpected that shed a tremendous amount of light on the Hezbollah strategy. He talked about Cyprus, and he threatened Cyprus with war. And the reason he threatened Cyprus with war was that Hezbollah has this role to play in any war with Israel. Back in October, Nasrallah wanted to escalate, to show that he's part of the axis of resistance, and to do that in support of Hamas. Hamas's attack on October 7 was an attack born in Hezbollah strategic thinking. Hezbollah has literally put videos online over the last 3-4 years in which their fighters are seen crossing the border, training to cross the border, take over Israeli towns and villages, take hostages. That whole idea of penetrating the Israeli border and forcing the Israelis to reclaim ground in pitched ground battles, to take the battle out of the Arab neighbors of Israel, their ground, and actually drive it into Israeli ground, is a fundamental Hezbollah strategy. And when you talk to Hezbollah officials, or they don't talk to me, but when you listen carefully to them, or you see them interviewed in Al-Manar or Al Jazeera, it's fascinating the extent to which you would occasionally hear in October, November, frustration at Hamas for carrying out a version of that strategy, suggested by Hezbollah and Iran, that was much smaller than what Hezbollah was able to have put together had it gone first. In other words, Hamas ruined for Hezbollah the element of surprise for a similar kind of assault on Israel. As Hezbollah tried to ramp up to show the Muslim and Arab world that it was part of the fight, it got an order from Iran. And that order was, I'm going to cartoonishly simplify it, but it's the most fundamental thing you need to know about that order. That order was, don't be destroyed. Iran built out Hezbollah massively. Hezbollah was not literally built by Iran. It comes out of Arab Shiism. The founders of Hezbollah were students at Najaf in Iraq, in southern Iraq, and then they're Lebanese, and then they begin founding Hezbollah in the Bekaa Valley among the Shia community there in the 1980s. But since certainly the Israeli withdrawal in 2000 from Lebanon, but also long before that, the Iranians became the major patron of Hezbollah, the major funder. The vast majority of Hezbollah's arsenal in South Lebanon is, in one way or another, Iranian delivered, Iranian built for them, Iranian funded. And it's to the point where Iran really can give Hezbollah orders. In other words, it really is an arm of the Revolutionary Guard Corps. It has some political sensitivities within Lebanon that Iran doesn't, but it pretty much serves. That is not true, for example, of Shia militias in Iraq, who can sometimes be standoffish from Iran, side with the Americans for a while, shift back to Iranian support and patronage. It's a more complex relationship. The proxies in different places have different relationships. Hezbollah is, as much as it is possible to be, a branch of Iran, and Iran's investment in Hezbollah has one purpose. And that purpose is to serve as a second front against Israel, to exact massive costs from Israel if there should be an Israel-Iran war. And so its missile arsenal can't be lost in an Israel-Lebanon war. It has to be preserved for a future Israel-Iran war. And so Iran gave Hezbollah an order which was, don't be destroyed. And what Hezbollah has been trying to do for 10 months is calibrate its bombardment of Israel so that it looks significant, but doesn't trigger an Israeli assault. One of the ways that Hezbollah is preparing for the next war, should it come, should that Israel-Iran war break out, is that it is looking for a way to deal with the most fundamental Israeli advantage, which is the Air Force. Hezbollah has this missile arsenal. It can set Tel Aviv on fire for 50 straight days, launching 3,000 rockets a day at Tel Aviv, or missiles. Some of it is guided. It can hit specific buildings. It can bring down skyscrapers. It has this immense capacity to cause damage. But the Israeli Air Force will exact damage from South Lebanon, from the villages where Hezbollah has buried the vast majority of the arsenal, and it'll do it fast, and it'll do it hard to destroy as much as possible before it can be launched. And so to preserve that ability and to prevent the kind of destruction on Lebanon that'll make Hezbollah a historic mistake, a historic disaster for Lebanon, they have to manage to take out the Israeli Air Force. That's where some of the guided weaponry really comes into play. There is a strategy that Hezbollah has tried to build out to preempt an Israeli preemptive strike with a massive strike on targeted and guided strike on Israeli Air Force installations and bases that prevent the Israeli Air Force from being able to deploy in full and to create the kind of sheer kinetic damage that would keep Hezbollah from entering the fight with all of its might. The ability of Hezbollah to limit Israeli Air Force operations in that way is also a strategic advantage for Iran. And Israel's response, I'm getting to the point, Israel's response, I find all of this fascinating, but it gets to a really critical point. Israel's response to that Hezbollah plan to preemptively strike the Israeli Air Force, Hezbollah at least told us, it believes in this speech in June, is to operate out of Cyprus and possibly out of some other areas where the Israeli Air Force will land when its bases are destroyed and then continue the operation from there. Israel has had multiple rounds of training with the Cypriot Air Force. The latest one really trained this kind of operation where the Israeli Air Force actually operates from within Cyprus and Cyprus's Air Force installations. And Hassan Nasrallah in June said in a speech, public speech, talked about this and said, we will then target Cyprus. And Cyprus's prime minister then came out and said, we're not part of any war. What are you talking about, right? And really tried to sort of pull back and say, we're not going to let the Israelis fight a war from Cyprus. So in that sense, Nasrallah got what he wanted. He created a real fear in Cyprus, in European Union territory, of consequences for helping the Israelis in that future war. He also talked about how British forces operating from Cyprus supported Israel on April 14 in that massive missile strike from Iran, and sort of tried to incorporate that in. In other words, if you now help Israel the next time Iran launches a massive missile strike on Israel, you too will be targeted in a way you weren't before. There is an attempt by Iran's proxies to lay the groundwork. My fundamental point is, this is very detailed, and it's very technical, and it's people who are already gaming out the first step and the second step, and if you're going to start this way, you have to have already started the way before, and then the enemy will try and preempt that with their own step. Everyone is gaming out backwards preemptions for the other guy's potential preemptions. And so we are talking about a specific, carefully organized and orchestrated multi-billion-dollar and really brilliantly conceived strategic vision that Hezbollah has for causing genuinely massive damage, for thinking of itself as an arm of a fully functional state, a fully functional empire that aspires to control the Middle East, and that sees the destruction of Israel as the first step in A, its own imperial ambitions, but B, a much, much larger effort to redeem Islam and a very religious sort of vision of its own role in history. So this is serious, and this is likely. And Hezbollah exists for nothing else. And Iran did not spend such a vast percentage of its GDP on all of these proxies and all of these missile capabilities all around Israel, not to use them. And that, to me, first of all, there's a specific military problem that I tried to just sort of sketch out in some of its basic ideas that the Israelis are working on, and the enemy is working on, and the allies are working on, and everybody's thinking carefully about this. And let's hope we preempt before they preempt, or we have answers to their preemption, and then we succeed. We can fail. We can fail disastrously. But on balance, my money is on us. They have failed disastrously in order of magnitude more than we have, and they've destroyed their own countries in the attempt, and we flourish from generation to generation. So I'm not, the tactical win that Hezbollah is seeking doesn't worry me quite so much as the strategic significance of everything I just said. Hopefully we win that tactical round, and our Air Force has freedom of operation in Lebanon and also in Iran, and we can exact the kind of costs that make everything that Iran has spent a waste of its money and time, and makes the Arab world wake up from, or the parts of the Arab world that Iran can dominate, wake up from the idea that this is a good idea to let Iran dominate them. Israel's fundamental strategy at this point, A, needs to be, I'm finishing in 1 minute, A, needs to be, and B, it appears has already pivoted toward pulling Iran out from behind that curtain. Iran wants to, as the euphemism in the Middle East said in every Arab capital goes, Iran is fighting Israel to the last Arab. Israel's job is to exact costs on Iran that Iran cannot deflect, and pull Iran out from behind the curtain of other people absorbing the costs. So an escalation in which Lebanon is devastated is terrible for Israel and terrible for Lebanon. There have to be massive costs to Iran. And that is a place where the Jewish world comes into play as a lobbying world to tell the world, the international community, the West, the people who defended us on April 14, Iran must pay the cost or nations will be demolished in the Middle East. They already have. And B, if Iran pays the cost, there is a much larger chance that we de-escalate. Iran's basic problem today and Hezbollah's basic fundamental strategic flaw today is that they've been too successful. They have tried to convince the Israelis that they plan to destroy the Israelis through this death of 1,000 cuts, this massive, constant, low-intensity warfare. Here's the bad news. They succeeded. The Israelis are convinced that this is a war that will go on until their destruction. And that why is that bad for Hezbollah and Iran? Friends, whatever community you come from in the world, your community is more nervous about what is about to happen than the average Israeli. Talk to your Israeli friends, talk to your Israeli family. They're going about their day. They already know Iran wants to destroy them. And we're going to go through another round, and then there's going to be 6 more rounds, and then there's going to be 14 more rounds after that. They have used that moment, and they have used that escalatory capacity, and they have nowhere to escalate to. They've already told us they're going to murder us all. And so Israelis are firm in the belief that they can do this. They're pushing forward. Hezbollah is going to try and preempt. Iran is going to try and make sure everyone else pays the cost except it. Israel's fundamental strategy in that scenario is basically laid out. That is, I think, what is basically happening at the moment. And I'm going to throw the ball to Jonathan's court to hear much more.
And we're going to take the questions at the end, okay, Rob? Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me, everyone? Edna, yeah? Okay, great. Thank you, Haviv. Insightful as always, and I listen to you often as well. I think it's the 2nd or 3rd time that we collaborate, and I'm very happy that we're doing it here. To follow on a few of the points that I had planned to speak about and expand, first thing that I want to make clear to everybody is that I'm sure that most of you know, I no longer speak on behalf of the IDF. I never spoke on behalf of the Israeli government. And today I am a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, which is a DC-based think tank that has a mission statement of making life as difficult and horrible as possible for the enemies of democracy, specifically Iran, China, Russia, and other supporters of terror organizations. So that's my perspective. What you'll hear from me is based on a lot of IDF information and other Israeli sources, and a lot of thinking and analysis done by FDD experts, and of course, my own analysis and thoughts. But that's the perspective, just so you know what you're going to hear. I'd like to start with perhaps the most important comment, which relates a little bit to what Haviv said, but I'd like to stress one point. We currently may be in the middle of a strategic shift from an Israeli point of view in strategy. And what do I, with regards to Iran? What do I mean with that? For many years, you could argue 15, 20, some could even argue 25 years, but let's say at least for 15 years, perhaps a little bit longer, Iran has had the strategy that Haviv spoke about, basically fighting through proxies and building a ring of fire around Israel, fighting a war of attrition until Israel is weak enough to be destroyed in one final big move by the various proxies. I had an interesting conversation yesterday, and a person, my counterpart, said something that I think is worth thinking about. And it connects also to what Haviv said about the tension between Hamas and Hezbollah, and the fact that Hezbollah were angry that Hamas basically stole their plans and outed the plans before Hezbollah had an opportunity to do it. It could be that Iran, just like Israel, misinterpreted and underestimated Hamas's intentions over the years, and that is how we failed so miserably to understand what Hamas was preparing, and we failed so miserably to prepare for it and to respond, and hence the catastrophe of October the 7th. It could be that Iran, in its overall strategy against Israel, saw half a year or 8 months, 9 months of mayhem in Israel, political, social, military, and misinterpreted it as the opportune time to deliver a significant blow against Israel. And hence, Hamas did their attack on October the 7th, probably actually thinking that they would be able to inflict even more damage on Israel than what they did. And that's an important point that we can think about when we speak about strategy, what Israeli mistakes have been vis-a-vis Hamas and Hezbollah, and what maybe the Iranian axis thought that they saw in Israel, a weakened and incohesive society, and that is perhaps one of the reasons why they decided to attack 10 months ago. I speak about that because I think we may be in a situation today where there's a shift in Israeli strategy towards Iran. And the fact that Israel has did what Israel did in Tehran, which was adding lots of insult to injury, and the fact that Hania was killed inside Tehran in an apartment that belongs to the Revolutionary Guard, which is supposed to be the safest of the safest, perhaps is pulling Iran out of the shadows. And perhaps it indicates that Israel is now willing or wants to force Iran or to challenge Iran's strategy. I've been speaking about the need for a new Israeli strategy for quite a long time, many months, and I've thought it when I was in uniform as well. And I've been saying that, and many others have been saying it, not out of a position of being a warmonger, but simply of assessing our military situation and the geostrategic military situation in the Middle East. The bottom line is that I think that until Israel changes that equation and puts a heavy price tag on Iran, the Islamic regime of Iran, for its act of indirect and direct warfare against Israel, we're going to continue to live in this almost perpetual state of war or fighting or readiness for any Iranian attack, indirect or direct. And up until now, let's be frank, Israel really hasn't challenged Iran's strategy. The Iranian strategy has worked very well for the Islamic Republic, and I think it has not worked well for Israel. And what we may be seeing now is a shift. In the coming days or weeks, it will be very important to see how much Iran are going to deviate from their strategy and whether or not Israel has actually changed its strategy. In that lane, I think I was very surprised to hear a very fast and unequivocal response from the supreme leader of Iran, Khamenei himself, after Hania's assassination, that Iran is going to retaliate. It's out of form, and maybe Haviv remembers otherwise, but I do not recall the Iranians saying such harsh things so fast after a military attack or a military event, and basically committing themselves and forcing. Now they are bound to respond by Iranian hands against Israel. And I was a bit surprised to hear that, because usually the Iranians are more cool-headed and have longer strategic planning and don't usually expose their hand and what they're going to do next in such a fast way. Definitely not at the mouth or in the words of Khamenei, the supreme leader. That may indicate that we are indeed seeing change, important change in the Middle East. A few pieces that I think are important to emphasize as we try to look at this multi-dimensional puzzle, which is Israel's situation. Regarding Gaza, a very interesting timing that the IDF exposed today a massive tunnel, smuggling tunnel between Rafah and Gaza. I think it is not a coincidence. I think it is related to the Israeli discourse about whether or not Israel can allow Egypt control over the border, or if Israel can allow itself to relinquish control over the so-called Philadelphia corridor. I assess that the material, the pictures and the video of this very big tunnel, which is about 12 or 13 feet high and big enough to drive a truck through, multiple for a long distance, I suppose that is part of shaping the narrative of what Israel needs to do in any end of fighting agreement. And what Israel is signaling is we cannot leave Philadelphia because of the threat of tunnels underneath. And if we leave, Hamas will be able to replenish their weapons. I assume that videos and photos have been in IDF position for quite some time. And I do not think that the timing is accidental for it to be exposed now. I've been waiting a lot of weeks for image to be out. And of course, the target audience is Cairo and also Israeli decision makers and the US. To be clear, I think that the IDF, tactically and strategically speaking, but mostly tactically, has done a slow but quite a good job at dismantling Hamas's military capabilities all across the board, killing seniors, killing military commanders, rank and file, infrastructure and production facilities. All of that has been significantly degraded. And we can just look at what the type of response that Hamas was able to muster and how they communicated it after Hania was assassinated. A handwritten note filmed on a phone, not the fancy usual productions that we used to see from Hamas, and rockets towards Kiryat Gat. Not Tel Aviv, not Jerusalem, not an Air Force base. And I think that is indicative of Hamas's situation and what the IDF has been able to do to degrade it. But of course, the issue is, how can Israel transform the Gaza Strip from what it was into something that won't pose a threat towards Israel? And here, at the strategic level, I do not yet see the light. I know that there's lots of talk. I myself visited Gulf states 2 weeks ago, and I heard very positive things. I know that there's been official Israeli delegations, and lots of interesting things are being said. But in terms of Tachlis and how will Israel, from its own interest, transform the Gaza Strip into not an area that will be conducive for a Hamas 2.0, still remains to be seen. I am really at loss to understand why Israel stopped prosecuting UNRWA, and why Israel, diplomatically and militarily, is not on the offensive anymore when it comes to UNRWA, just as there's now a discussion about the Philadelphia corridor. Will Israel remain there or not? I think that a very important part for any success, strategic success of Israel, will be that Israel demands a removal, a permanent and irreversible removal of UNRWA from Gaza. Otherwise, things will go back to square one. Hamas or Hamas 2.0 or some other jihadi iteration will return to power, and UNRWA will be the facilitator as it was before. And I wonder why that is not the case and why Israel isn't on the offensive against UNRWA. I think that our biggest challenge as we speak is Hezbollah. And as Haviv said, by the way, my assessment is a little bit different, even though I'm not in Israel currently, but I speak with family and friends and listen to media. I am not entirely sure that Israelis are going about their days as normal under the or waiting for the Iranian response. I actually have a different assessment of it, and it feels very much like a much more serious, I would even say, paralysis of many parts of the country in anticipation of the Iranian attack, and it looks different. That's not to say that Israelis are losing their cool, but nevertheless, I differ on Haviv's assessment on that, because this feels different. Hezbollah, interesting points about Cyprus. That would, of course, put Hezbollah in a totally different strategic situation to attack a sovereign EU member, and that would be very interesting, probably a strategic mistake to do, but nevertheless interesting. I also agree that it is based on frustration, but let's be frank. I don't think that any Israeli, even those many in the military who have access to information and understand the arsenal that Hezbollah has available, I don't think that we really understand how difficult and how horrendous a war against Hezbollah would be in terms of the damage to infrastructure and the loss of human life. I'll just say this. I think that up until now, Israel has been tactically successful in killing Hezbollah seniors and taking out a few important capabilities. More than 400 Hezbollah commanders and fighters have been killed, which is a good number. Some of them very, very important, including Fuad Shukr last week. But on the strategic level, it still favors Hezbollah because Israelis are not in their homes, and it is an unprecedented social achievement of Hezbollah. And to be frank, I struggle to see the exit mechanism that will allow Israel to end the war in the north without having the ability to safely return Israelis to the north. And it's kind of in my mind, and with this I will close with one more sentence, a kind of a catch-22 situation whereby there's no real diplomatic solution yet, and I do not see diplomatic activity or urgency to find one that will de-escalate the situation. And then on the other hand, the war won't be able to end until Israelis are able to go back home, and they won't be able to go back home before there's some kind of agreement between Israel and Hezbollah as to the new rules of engagement, perhaps a half of an implementation of the existing UN framework architecture, Resolution 1701, which sadly is a sad failure. To summarize the opening statements, I would say this: we might be in a strategic shift, which I think in a few weeks or months we'll be able to look back and say this was the point that Israel changed the equation in the Middle East. Israel has a lot of tools to attack the Iranian regime and to destabilize it. So far, Israel has been playing defense and absorbing Iranian indirect aggression. Israel has the tool and perhaps now also the strategy to inflict a price. And I think that the strike in Hudaydah that the IDF did, the successful strike, which perhaps some have already forgotten because so much is happening, but I draw a direct imaginary line between Hudaydah in Yemen and Bandar Abbas in Iran. Why Bandar Abbas? Because Bandar Abbas is the main port of export of Iranian oil products and petrochemicals. And I think that when the Minister of Defense said, I know that the entire Middle East is watching the flames in Hudaydah, that was specifically designed for Iranian ears, and I think designed to send a chill up or down Iranian spines when it comes to their ability to continue to fund what they're doing. And they do that through the port of Bandar Abbas. And Israel indicated that it has the ability and also the willingness to strike those. So we're in interesting times, bracing for an Iranian attack response, which I think would be out of form, and then, of course, preparing Israeli responses to it. Time will tell where this is going, and there's quite a lot of room for worry and pessimism, but there's also room for optimism, and I share Haviv's essential optimism regarding the Zionist project, the miracle called Israel, and the fact that despite a lot of challenging situations and bad decisions on our part, things are going forward and we are indeed thriving in our homeland. Thank you.
Okay, how do we want to do this? I have 5, 6, 11, 36 questions to ask. I want to take questions also from the audience. Are they
Let's
in the
start
chat?
with a dialogue, Haviv. Let's start with
Okay.
with the dialogue between you two. Thank you.
Okay, Jonathan, I'm just going to ask what I want to know and completely ignore the audience, if that's okay. What options do we have? Hudaydah is the obvious one. It's the big one. It's the one everybody's talking about. If
Bandar
we
Abbas,
want
you
to-
mean?
Bandar Abbas, I mean, the Hudaydah model.
Yeah. Yeah.
Without telling us anything secret, I mean, unless you really want to, how much can Israel inflict pain? Now, any pain it inflicts, obviously, Hezbollah's response will target our oil fields and things like that. Probably more critically than the gas fields themselves in the Mediterranean would be the oil shipments of tankers that we actually need to fuel the economy. But that is potentially something we can defend, or that would actually spark that northern war. Or what are the options and what are the dilemmas when it comes to pulling Iran out from behind the curtain of Arab countries and actually exacting a massive cost on Iran if we actually move forward in that direction?
In my opinion, it's actually more complex than that, because up until now, you and I, we haven't spoken about it. The real big elephant in the Middle East is the Iranian nuclear program, which has been advancing. The Iranians have sped up the advance of their program, and today they have already crossed one Rubicon. Let's say that there are 3 Rubicons to cross. One of them is to have enough enriched material to build a bomb. They've done that, they've achieved it, and that is no longer anything that the world needs to worry about, because Iran has enough fissile material, according to the International Atomic Agency, to build at least 15 nuclear bombs. So that's been achieved by centrifuges, in violation of sanctions and in violations of restrictions, and they've done that. Second part about the bomb, the mechanism itself, unknown. Have they mastered the technology? Have they not mastered it? Have they done testing? Do they have the technological know-how of putting fissile material, a detonating mechanism, inside the casing of a bomb, a missile, and to have it fired out of the atmosphere and then into the atmosphere again and detonating? Unknown. But we know that the Iranians are proceeding. And I think we have to keep the whole Iranian nuclear program in perspective, because it's really a big part of the whole equation here. And when we speak about pulling Iran out of the shadows, I think we have to keep our aim very clearly on the most strategic threat towards Israel, which isn't Hezbollah, and it's not Hamas, and it's not Iranian proxies in Syria. It is their quest to become a nuclear military power. Sadly, without going into too much detail, I think that the military options are very limited when it comes to stopping the Iranians from achieving this. Our military options against the regional expansion of Iran, against the Quds Force, against their proxies, against their ability to fund these organizations, I think are quite diverse. And I think that you are very correct in saying that, of course, the enemy has a vote, right? We will do something, Iran will respond, either directly or through their proxies, and it's definitely a multi-dimensional chess piece where Israel has weaknesses, has offensive capabilities and strength, has defensive capabilities, but we are also exposed. We're a small island country, depending on 99% of everything that comes into Israel comes through 2 ports, Haifa and Ashdod. And one of them is within striking range of Hezbollah in terms of long-range shore-to-sea missiles, as you pointed out correctly. However, I think that one thing that is not spoken about enough is the balance of efforts that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard is able to manage. Their job is basically a twofold job. One part of their job is to safeguard the regime and to make sure that the regime is stable and protected in Iran. And the second one is the expeditionary one, where they are exporting the so-called revolution, exporting the revolution, which is code word for spreading terrorism and basically fighting against Iran's enemies abroad. In my assessment, based on a few conversations with Iran experts in Israel and in the US, it looks as if over the years, Israel and the world have been allowing the Revolutionary Guard to do 70 or 80% offense and very little defense, as in making sure that the regime is stable and protected from within Iran. I think that needs to change. And even without doing big, bold, kinetic moves, I think Israel has the ability to, if it's smart and coordinates with allies and formulates a comprehensive strategy, I think Israel can force the Iranians to shift their balance, maybe to a 50-50 scenario or to a 60-40 defense-offense scenario for the Revolutionary Guard. That will have the cumulative effect on Iran's ability to fund Hezbollah and fund Hamas and their proxies in Iran, to destabilize Jordan. We haven't spoken about Jordan, but I know that you're following it. I'm definitely following Iranian activities in Jordan, how they're trying to smuggle weapons and to destabilize northern Jordan. That's something to worry about and to monitor. But they have the ability to do this in terms of resources, A, because sanctions are not working, B, because funds are constantly unfrozen, and given to the Iranian regime, and C, because nobody's really forcing them to play defense. And I think Israel has a lot of tools that are short of all-out war in order to do that. And I think that really it is time for Israel to force the Iranians into a different posture where they have to do much more defense and have less leisure and availability and energy and resources and time to do offense, because we are at the brunt of that offense, and it is our interest to change that equation.
Two questions. One of them is the United States to push Iran back into a defensive posture. We can do these spectacular, astonishing, we should not have the capability to do the things we do. And when you read about them, they are more fascinating than, they're really quite remarkable. It's like our judo Olympic showing. We punch way above our weight. It doesn't make any sense, which is really fun. However, it is an order of magnitude below what a concerted Western, American-led especially, effort could impose on Iran, which could be actually destructive to the regime. And that is not in the cards and won't be in the cards. And there isn't a will in the West. And Europe has just slowly begun to build out military forces because they are spooked by Putin. They're still not willing to seriously engage in the Middle East in any meaningful way on that score. Do we have American backing? Should we expect it? I'm not asking you to tell Americans who to vote for. This is a call without too many Americans. But and if you have a comment on the difference between a Harris or a Trump administration in that regard, should we look to America for help? And just the second question, which is just tied in, is the Israeli government. I don't want to ask you about politics. I only want to ask you about the piece of the politics that's a military question. And then I'm done with my questions and we'll go to the audience questions. This is a government deeply, I avoided politics for months. And then the polls started coming out from left wing and right wing and every kind of pollster, and they all said the same thing. This government has a profound public trust deficit. The Israeli public doesn't trust the government to be doing the right thing. Amos Harel published an analysis today in Haaretz that said that the government hasn't talked. It's not telegraphing, it's not explaining, it's not telling Israelis there are these enormous questions and enormous dilemmas, and it's dealing with them, and here's what to expect, and there could be a terrible war. Israelis are hearing nothing at all, and the government's going for months at a time without a single, Netanyahu, but not just Netanyahu. So does this government have the capacity to lead a country through that difficult period? What would it take for this government to be able to do that? Maybe is the better way to phrase the question.
Yeah, there are two questions that are connected to the same thing. Sadly, and I always, I do lots of interviews in English, different international channels, and I always try to air the dirty Israeli laundry, to do that at home and not across the world and for our enemies to see and rejoice from. However, having said that, I think that on this call, since we are it's not a media situation, I'll say this. My assessment, I think I agree with your assessment or what you insinuate in your question, and that is perhaps the biggest obstacle that Israel has to achieve its goals and to safeguard its future. It is the current government, its decision-making, the lack of a coherent and coordinated strategy, and very importantly, what appears in my eyes to be a very tremendously big challenge on part of Israel to formulate any type of a coalition with other countries, which isn't only about defending Israel against incoming rockets and Iranian attacks, but also about positive change in the Middle East. And it's connected directly to the prime minister, his baggage, the government, its ministers, its behavior before October the 7th and its behavior after October the 7th. And in general, I think that is perhaps the biggest strategic challenge that we have. I think it's something that must be addressed at the highest levels. And sadly, I don't think that we will be able to inflict significant change on our enemies before we have our own house in order. And yes, I see the polls, and I have my own personal opinions, which I try not to share with anybody because usually my perspective is the military one. But here it really it's on the seam between military and strategic and political, and therefore it is very relevant. Of course, November elections in the US will be very influential, and they can change in a certain way the whole equation. But bottom line, I agree with you. I agree, Ariel, if you could mute yourself, thank you. I agree with your assessment about the strategic challenges that we have, and also about Europe, their focus and willingness. I never count on Europe anyhow when it comes to doing anything bold and substantial, if it's not to criticize Israel. The only relevant country is the US, and I don't think that in this current situation that is something that Israel can build on. That's a
Okay.
short and pessimistic answer, which kind of agrees with your assumption.
If our greatest weakness is internal, then our greatest weakness is subject to being fixed. I took that as optimistic. That's how I roll. It's kind of my brand. Okay. I want to a couple of things. One, what about supporting opposition in Iran trying to force a leadership change? Let me just, as I ask you this question, I'm deeply pessimistic that that's possible. A majority of Iranians don't want the regime, but a minority are willing to die for it. And so that is not an option available to us. I have read. Do you know different? Can you enlighten us on the question of regime change? It seems to solve 11 different strategic problems all at once.
I agree. It is really, in Hebrew we say Reshit Hatzirim. This is where all the roads start. This is where all the axis start from. This is the really ground zero. And if Israel can effect change, that would of course solve regional terror, instability. That would solve the nuclear threat against Israel, which, by the way, I don't think can be done really militarily. And it would solve a lot of things and perhaps pave the way for greater normalization in the Middle East and much better ties between Israel and its neighbors. Up until now, I am not aware of anything of substance that has been done. I look at two past examples, and actually to take your hat of being, the optimist, there have been two times in recent Iranian history. I believe it was 2016, and then under Obama, and then a year-ish ago with Mahsa Amini, the headscarf revolution, where there were significant protests out on Iranian streets. And for instance, FDD monitored that. We had a tracker, a live heat map of protests in Iran based on social media, which was done by AI, which basically had heat maps of where protests were happening and how intense they were. And for many weeks, they were very intense in Tehran, in Isfahan, in Shiraz, and many other locations. And then they stopped because the regime got the upper hand. They apprehended, killed, terrorized, or otherwise incarcerated people. And the opposition had no help. Not the opposition, but the protesters had no help. One major problem is that I do not see another political structure that can, if the regime is toppled or taken out of balance, swoop in and actually pose a threat to the chokehold that the Revolutionary Guard, the Basij, and the regime has on Iran. But the positive thing is that nobody's ever tried, and we don't know if exactly how the Iranian regime will respond. I'll just a quick example, and with that I'll conclude. I visited Berlin a few months ago. There speaking, and I went to the museum, the East-West Museum, which is a nice museum, not very academic, but very engaging. And I was very interested in seeing the intel assessments of Western powers the day before the wall fell. The wall fell and Eastern Germany collapsed. Of course, then, just as now, intel organizations got it totally wrong, and they had absolutely no clue that East Germany was crumbling weak from within, and it only needed one push, and it fell, and it crumbled. And there was no advance warning. There were no CIA assessments, and there were no West German assessments of how weak that regime was, how weak the Stasi was, and how weak the institutions were. And then it just fell. So I don't suggest to build strategy on chance, but I think that the world, as in US and Israel, has never tried really supporting the government, and B, we haven't really started making life difficult for the Iranian regime, and we haven't started to focus soft and hard power on the regime. And maybe if we try, then that tremendous, authentic, real pressure from within, from Iranians who are sick and tired of being in this backwater regime that oppresses them and takes away their rights and focuses their livelihood and taxes not on prosperity but on their imperialistic dreams, maybe they will be able to rise up and transition. We don't know.
Thank you. Edna, what are we doing for time?
Actually, we have more time, so we were supposed to finish.
Okay.
We have time, so we can take more questions.
So let me go to Robert has a hand up, and then there's one last question from David, and we'll finish with that. Robert, just keep it a question.
Thank you very much for both of you. Very interesting. You were talking about Cyprus, and Cyprus is not Cyprus completely at the EU, but it's part of Turkey as well. The way Mr. Erdogan is interfering the last few weeks with a big military organization in the Middle East and part of the NATO, how could that affect?
You want to go first, Haviv, or me?
I think it has been very clear to Israelis for a very long time, maybe I'll just add this to the question, that Erdogan, the AKP party of Erdogan of Turkey, is a Islamic Brotherhood ally and ideologically Islamist and connected very closely to Qatar, and like Qatar hosts Hamas leaders, funds Hamas. A lot of the unrest we've seen on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem by pro-Hamas factions in Jerusalem were funded literally by Turkey. And so to me, Turkey is an ideological backer of Hamas because of its own the AKP party's own internal ideology. It is Hamas intellectually. So none of that surprises me. What surprises me, and I had a meeting this morning with some political science professors from America and one Italian ambassador, I think, to NATO, and he asked about Turkey, and I said, they're Hamas ideologically. I mean, here's go to Wikipedia. Don't work hard, right? Here's the sort of the party's origins, the party's ideas. Here's 3 books written about the party. Just look it up. It's your guys' problem that they're in NATO. It's not my problem. I expect them to behave like Hamas. Is that the future? Is that changeable? Is that I'm not surprised by Turkey, and I think they're mainly NATO's problem, not mine. Am I wrong?
I think you are, as per your habit, Haviv, right and spot on in your analysis.
But also optimistic. Yeah,
I would add to that a certain level of surprise at the blunt threat that Erdogan makes, because it also exposes him to pushback and sanctions, and it can in the future jeopardize Turkey's partnership with NATO, and it can expose Turkey to strategic things that I think outweigh in the Turkish assessment of pros and cons. I think going after Israel and being more aggressive against Israel will pose a lot of challenges for Turkey, and it will be big long-term strategic deficits that I don't think that the Turks want to do, which will influence their economic standing in Europe, their trade, and also their security situation and the supply of weapons, US advanced weapon systems, and funding and projects, etc. And I think that it was a bit surprising to see such a blunt. I mean, I listened carefully to what Erdogan said. It was, part of one sentence, and it was 2 words, which, I mean, I've heard more explicit threats, but even the fact that he said it is indeed surprising. Maybe a slip of the tongue, maybe his, he was voicing his heart's desires, or maybe something that indicates a future strategy, one that could be very, very dangerous for the region, which could really put us in military confrontation with a NATO country, which is quite amazing. Speaking of NATO, I just want to reflect on, that alliance and the, in my mind, very poor judgment and strategic posture of that alliance and the countries that are part of that club. Qatar, you mentioned, is a senior non-member with strategic ties to NATO that enjoys a lot of support and, of course, has the US base there. Turkey is a member, and I think it can, on the bigger piece, not only on the Israeli level, really put into motion perhaps some kind of revamping of NATO. And if we add that together with the tension coming from Russia and how this system is now forced to act differently, it may put into motion things that are much bigger than Israel and the Middle East, because for quite some time, I think that the whole saying of I wouldn't want to be a member of a club that would have me as a member. So the club membership of NATO isn't looking very hot. I mean, if these are countries that are part of it, I think that is a branding and strategic problem for NATO. Of course, Israel will have to deal with it, but an issue. Turkey is a significant threat with significant military capabilities, but I think that they are also exposed to the fact that their economy is very much dependent on them behaving nicely. And if they don't, then they really would have an issue.
There are two final questions, and I will just end with them. One of them I'm going to take the prerogative and just answer quickly, and that's Israeli political. And the last one is I'm going to throw it to you about whether we face ultimately an existential crisis. Or you spoke to this in one sentence, maybe elaborate on that, and we'll go out with that. If trust is so low in the government, Emilio writes, who is ready to take over in an election? I want to say a couple of things really quickly. One, a third of Israelis trust Netanyahu and want Netanyahu to continue in all the polls. It ranges between 28% and 40%. Different pollsters, different methodologies, but nevertheless, that is roughly the range that is still very much in Netanyahu's camp. And when you talk to them, there's still a lot of distrust there, but there's the sense that everyone else is worse. In other words, I don't trust Gantz to take that baton and move forward. I don't trust Lapid to face this moment. Netanyahu is terrible in this way or that way. He's dishonest. He doesn't give talks. He doesn't explain to the Israeli, but he can basically handle this situation, and that's the priority. You hear that from a lot of those people. I want to counter that with just a tiny perspective from Israeli history. One of the problems I think we're facing with Netanyahu isn't that he's good or bad. It's that he is totally in charge. And we have not really had a prime minister this centralized and in control of the basic structures and infrastructures of government since David Ben-Gurion. And the argument that I hear a lot of people making isn't that, Gantz is worse or Gantz is better, or can we trust, Lapid? The basic argument is that Israeli governments used to have weaker prime ministers. I'll give you an example. The people in this room are very Israel-focused people. I would suggest to you that if I were to ask you, who is the foreign minister of Israel right now, a lot of you will have to think 10 seconds before remembering that it's Israel Katz. And the reason you'll have to think 10 seconds is because Israel Katz doesn't really do anything. And there isn't really a function for a foreign minister of Israel right now, because huge government bodies, agencies, functions over Netanyahu's 13 years in power have been moved into the prime minister's office. So all the major diplomacy with the Arab states, with the US, with any strategic, the rapprochement with Turkey that was attempted a couple of years ago, all of that was through the Mossad and through the National Security Council, directly answerable to Netanyahu. And on countless other issues, grand strategy, economic strategy, that's all moved into the prime minister's office. And that's created a situation where if Netanyahu's not paying attention, or if he's busy politicking, those things don't get done. And so a huge amount of Israeli politics, of Israeli policy, just doesn't get done. The big argument that you hear from people aware of, let's say, the inadequacies or we don't yet know if Gantz knows how to run a country. When they make the argument that Netanyahu has to go, their argument is, we need a weak prime minister, because then we will have a government. How did Doris Kearns Goodwin describe Lincoln's cabinet? A team of rivals, a government of the type that Levi Eshkol led successfully in the Six-Day War, and Israeli government, the government structure that built Israel was of multiple fiefdoms all working together, sometimes at cross purposes, pushing ahead. It's the centralization around Netanyahu that is weak in the government as much as anything else. So I don't quite know, but who should replace? And I'm not going to make a political argument, but the argument about who could step in to replace Netanyahu, it's a little bit like after John Paul II, who was such an influential figure in the church. In his replacement, they elected a pope who was very, very quiet and an academic, and to stabilize the system after that strong figure. I will leave it at that, and I will just send back to Jonathan one last question. So is this existential? Is the survival of Israel on the kaskas, on the
verge,
table
on the brim?
here?
Yeah.
Are we on the brink of something, or should we be more relaxed?
I'll just add one thing, my perspective to what you said about the centralization of government, and I would give you the perspective of how Israel conducts its public affairs, public diplomacy, and PR. A very much an example of exactly what you said, of a non-existent system. There isn't one. Israel does not have a public diplomacy system. There are a few organizations that are hollow in actions and hollow in budgets, and we effectively do not have a communication strategy or means to implement it. Why? Because of the same reason that Haviv described before, and it is something that I find personally very, very sad and harmful for Israel, strategically speaking, and I've been part of that system for quite a lot of years. And I think that Haviv's points are spot on. To end on a positive note, no room for complacency, no room to be light-hearted, but also no room for doomsday thoughts and existential threat. We are under significant military threat. The chances that we will continue to live under the Iranian strategy of continuous fighting exists, but I see us being both capable, having the ability to, and with better leadership, being able to actually change our strategic situation, and in a few years be in a totally different stage. There's a lot of choppy waters and turbulent seas until we get there, but I can definitely chart a path forward, which is a positive one, where my children here in Israel will live in a better situation than what we live now, and hopefully the grandchildren will be in an even better situation. Possible? Will it happen? I have no idea. But at the end of the day, I think that we are facing significant threats, perhaps bigger than what we've faced in the past, but Israel definitely has the tools and the ability. The amazing people of Israel, Am Israel, in Israel and abroad, I think, as always, are our biggest strength and advantage over our enemies.
I'm going to quote David Ben-Gurion: "It matters much more what we do than what they say." These
Indeed,
are our fate. It is ours to build. All
So
right.
before I
thank
you, Haviv and Jonathan,
throwing it back
before
to
I
Edna.
thank you, before we wrap up, I want to give Stephen an opportunity to ask the real final question.
Thanks, Edna. I appreciate very much both Jonathan and Haviv. Enormously interesting, your analysis. I do want to ask a question I'm sure is on everybody's mind about the hostages. It hasn't really been a major thrust of us today, and clearly none of us want that to get lost. I ask it from a couple of perspectives: the hostages themselves, clearly, the expectations of the Israeli public, I guess also in the context of, and I know you guys don't like getting into the politics, but I don't know how you can completely divorce the politics from the civil and military strategy in the context of, how would that affect a government? Could it impact a government change? My understanding with any potential government change or another election is that there's a very long gap now. Obviously, this break, the summer break, and the mechanism that would actually occur. And obviously, by that time, my understanding is that couldn't occur until sometime maybe late first quarter, early second quarter of next year. And then in the meantime, you're going to have definitely a new president. two very, very different possible presidents and how that would impact that as well. And is that possibly even a strategy of Netanyahu to push it off until after that? I guess in the hope of a Republican of Trump personally. So it's a lot of questions, but it's all sort of aimed at from the view of the hostages and the potential change of government.
I'll take it first, in the hope that Jonathan contradicts me. I have only bad things to say, bad news on that regard. Most of the 100 hostages still in captivity are estimated by IDF intelligence to be dead. The 40, maybe 50, I don't understand entirely the intelligence itself, and the numbers themselves are fairly good estimates rather than exact in every way, who remain alive are Hamas's only last-ditch hope for survival. They are beginning to believe that Israel might actually be serious and see this through to the end. And that massively increases the interest in holding on to the hostages. And so the good news for the war is bad news for the hostages. The deal of 6 weeks of break is maybe doable. A lot of very big hawks who want to destroy Hamas, who see their legacy as destroying Hamas, like Gallant, are for the deal. Is Netanyahu playing politics with that deal? That would have seemed a monstrous thing for you to suggest to me 10 months ago. It no longer is a monstrous impossibility today. That doesn't mean Netanyahu is tactically wrong. That doesn't mean that pushing Hamas further against a wall and making them more desperate isn't maybe actually the best way to actually bring them to the table and get that deal out. Today, I heard an interview with a mother of a soldier who is a young man soldier who is held by Hamas, who totally and absolutely opposes the 6-week deal because she doesn't think we'll get to the second stage because the IDF is not going to pull out of Gaza. And so her son is not in that first round. And so we need a better solution, and we need a solution that reflects our strength. And our strength needs to actually be pushed, right? Hamas needs to be made to feel our strength. Jonathan said we're moving in Gaza very well tactically. That is something I've heard, from everyone involved, including, frankly, 2 brothers-in-law who fought in Gaza for 200 days. I mean, everyone has a sense that we're succeeding on the ground in Gaza. But the slowly is the question. Could we not force Hamas into more difficult decisions faster? And that would have helped get the hostages out. My complaint on Netanyahu and the hostages is not the complaint from the center left that he doesn't want to face elections, so he doesn't want to get them out because he doesn't want the war to end because then the elections come. My complaint on Netanyahu is the right-wing argument, the Smotrich argument, which is if you'd pushed them harder, faster, we would have been at a much better position in terms of hostages now. And so I am pessimistic. I think we've gotten a lot out, more than we had a right to expect on October 8th. I think that the rest are we can't give Hamas its survival, and we simply can't. And every agony and every pain that we feel for that we have one job between now and any future war, which is not to let them take another 245 hostages. And if we push them hard and fast and painful, we have a better chance of getting them out than if we make a deal.
Yeah, I think very well said. I am equally pessimistic, and I've been saying this in many interviews and analysis for months when there was talk and emotions and things happening and meetings in Cairo or in Qatar or in other places. I've looked at it basically the same, more or less, from day one, and it has gone into that direction. Hamas's only way of surviving are these Israeli hostages, and I think that they are using them as such. They were more clever at their psychological warfare before. Now I think that they're a little bit limited in their ability to conduct real psychological warfare. But I would say that, sadly, horribly, I agree with Haviv's assessment, both of the chances of getting our hostages home alive, and I've said this out of uniform, what took us so long to do what we've done against Hamas. We could have been in this situation, and I say this based on my military background, we could have been here 5-6 months ago, perhaps. And there were many, many months where Israel wasn't operating at anywhere near 50% capacity in Gaza, and that was precious time that sadly was lost. So bottom line, I do not see this happening, sadly, horribly. Obviously, long term, this will be probably remain the biggest, deepest, and most hurtful wound in the Israeli psyche, that we failed so badly, the IDF, defense establishment, government failed so badly as to allow Hamas to do this. But as much as I would want to be wrong, I do not see a way out that includes a substantial amount of the hostages being returned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan and Haviv. Wow, what an end to a call. I started this call pessimistic. I'm finishing this more pessimistic. I think knowledge is power. This time, I'm not sure it's power. It's knowing more is sometimes making us weaker. But what I learned from this conversation, that today more than ever, the need for us, for Keren HaYesod, is much more important than ever. Because when we hear about the government and the lack of its activity and what might happen in regional war that might come in the upcoming days, the needs for us, the communities around the globe, to support the state of Israel and the people of Israel is much more important than ever. So thank you very, very much for the time and for the knowledge that you've shared with us, Haviv and Jonathan. And for you, Keren HaYesod family around the world, we will be in touch with you in the upcoming days and weeks. We will keep you updated on the projects and where we're going to focus in once we have a better understanding. And our representatives on the ground will be in touch with you with all the information. So thank you very much for joining us today. And I want to thank on behalf of Sam as well. He couldn't actually be active on this call, but he was here with us the entire time. So thank you very, very much, and we will be in touch. Toda rabba.
Thank
All the
you.
best. Toda rabba. Thank you.
Shalom.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Haviv.
Thanks, Steve.
Be safe,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Be safe.